All right, we've still got a few logging in, but I'm going to go ahead and get going here. My name is Darren Morgan. I'm the nursery manager here at Chenard's Nursery, and we wanted to talk today about managing mason bees. So we'll talk a little bit about what is a mason bee and what do they do and how can we encourage mason bee success. And I would reiterate that we can take some verbal questions. So please mute while you're listening, but if you have a question to contribute, you can unmute, or if you're more comfortable, feel free to type it in the chat and we'll catch it as we go. All right, so mason bees. Well, what is a mason bee? Well, we have a lot of bees that perform pollination activity. And we are very familiar with honeybees because they are the big pollinators, both out in the landscapes and also commercially for agriculture. But honeybees are not native. They're all an introduced species. So even when we see wild honeybees, we are talking about bees that have escaped cultivation. They aren't actually native here. So the other bees we have in our area that do pollination are very diverse. And we have hundreds of species of native bee in Oregon, about 250, give or take, in Western Oregon. And they vary quite tremendously. So some differences really quickly amongst them. Honeybees are social bees. They live in very large colonies. That's one of the reasons they're such efficient pollinators. They are very casted. They have a reproductive queen, reproductive males that do nothing but reproduce, and then a whole batch of sterile female workers. Of our native bees, bumbles are kind of similar. Bumblebees are social bees as well, with a reproductive queen, male drones, and worker sterile females, but typically in much smaller volumes than honeybees. The rest of our native bees are solitary bees. So they behave really differently. They still have reproductive males that basically do their reproductive duties and then die off. But all females are fertile egg-laying females. They don't have a dedicated reproductive caste and sterile workers. So that means that for every bee you see out there working, she's also working to lay her own eggs and develop her own brood. So they have very different behaviors because of that. And native bees in Western Oregon include just a tremendous array of solitary bees, sweat bees and carpenter bees and mason bees, as we'll be talking about here. But really important to understand the difference there between your social bees and your solitary bees, because their behaviors are quite different. So mason bees, we have several species of mason bee in our area, and nationally a huge, tremendous diversity of them. We're talking primarily about blue orchard mason bee today. They're solitary native bees. They tend to nest in cavities. They don't tend to be very active burrowers. They tend to use natural cavities where possible. These can be cavities in harder wood from insect damage, or this can be cavities in the essentially hollow pieces of pithy stemmed plants. So one thing that differentiates the various types of solitary bee is what they use for their nesting material. And the mason bee is so named because as it lays its eggs in these cavities, it separates or partitions the cells for each egg to develop in with a daub of clay mud, and then they cap the cavity at the end with a larger daub of clay mud. So that's the name mason bee. There are different species of mason bees in our area, and they're active at slightly different periods of time. They all tend to be relatively early. The blue orchard mason bee is super early, and that's why it's so valuable for pollination. So blue orchard mason bee is native across a wide swath of the US, from British Columbia to Quebec and all the way down into the mid-states and down to even into California. So quite a largely distributed species. It is a very early bee. In Western Oregon, we see them emerging and starting to take pollinator activity as early as maybe mid to late February, when some of our earliest native flowers are beginning to push out. We see a more substantial increase as we get into March, and right now we're just coming into the main main peak of the development of the mason bees outdoors. This early behavior means that they will fly for pollen gathering and egg laying. They will fly in much cooler weather than honeybees and in much less pleasant weather, rainier or windier conditions than honeybees. So this means they're going to work very, very efficiently and without taking so many days off. It's a real problem with honeybees with our very early crops, like plums and pears in Western Oregon, that they are blooming before honeybees are active on a daily basis. We get occasional activity as we get above 55 or 60 degrees on honeybees, but we don't have the everyday flying. They'll stop when we get a little bit of drizzle, or they'll stop when the temperatures are no longer hitting 55 degrees for extensive periods of time. Mason bees, blue orchard mason bees don't. They have to be active this early, and they move through it rapidly, and they will tolerate worse conditions. They'll forage earlier in the day, later in the day, and under less desirable conditions. So typical colony of blue orchard mason bees, the males hatch first. They scout around, they find pollen resources, and they kind of hang out waiting for the females to emerge, and the females will emerge later. When they find those same pollen and nectar resources, they will mate. The males will die off pretty soon after mating. They're only around for a little while. And the females will commence egg laying and rearing. And they will go really gung-ho at it aggressively for their very short lifespan. Their adult lifespan is just a few weeks. And so, as I mentioned in the outset, these are all fertile females, so all of them are egg laying. And different individual colonies will hatch out at a slightly staggered development. So you'll continue to see blue orchard mason bees emerging and doing their pollination work and egg laying, starting as early as late February and going clear up through mid to late May. And then sometime around mid-May or late May at the latest, the last of the eggs are laid, the adults die off, and the vast majority of the mason bee lifespan is spent in developing egg, larva, pupation until the next spring hatch and emergence. So most of their life is inside those tubes. A question posted is, will there be a PDF of the slides available? I don't do a PDF of the slides. However, there is a recording of this session. It will take us a little while, but we will get it posted on our YouTube channel if you want to review it and take more detailed notes at your leisure. So when we're talking about managing mason bees, we're trying to encourage healthy populations. And so we're going to go through some steps of things you should be doing. But the question always comes up when I give these classes, well, nobody does this out in the wild. Why are we going so much labor into this? And our goal here is to encourage healthy pest-free populations. And remember that when you're doing your own habitats and encouraging mason bee increases, you're creating an artificially dense population. So we want to make sure that we're not introducing or spreading pests and diseases when we're not overpopulating the resource base either. Question came up from regarding the previous slide. Do the males die immediately after mating, or can they mate with other females? The males will mate with multiple females over the course of the breeding season, and they die shortly, but not immediately. They don't die in mating. It's a longer cycle for them. So things that we can do to encourage healthy pest-free populations include appropriate placement of houses, using appropriate nesting materials, and doing a good job of cleaning the cocoons and storing them properly so we're not introducing and spreading parasites and disease problems. So a mason bee house is simply a resting spot for nesting material. And the goal to your house is to provide some concentration of population, but also protection from moisture and from parasites. So Moisture is a key thing. Moisture for all bees is a real problem, especially in our very wet climate. And getting too much moisture back in the nesting material will cause mortality of the developing eggs and larvae. So we want to make sure that our house has at least a slight tip forward so that any water that does come into the house drains out instead of sitting in there amongst the nesting materials. And has an overhanging roof. I'd like to see a 2-inch overhang roof where possible to provide a little bit of extra shelter from our rainy spring season. To keep your bees active as long as possible in the day, it's really best to mount your house in morning sun, facing east or southeast, and to discourage various types of critters raiding. It's good to get a couple of feet off the ground. Anywhere from about maybe lower chest height up to just about head height is really good elevation to protect those nesting tubes. It's not always recognized as a priority right off the bat, but keeping your mason bee house well away from bird feeders or other areas of concentrated bird populations is very important. Birds do deal with bees as a tasty snack, and if you're in a high density feeding area or even a high density bird bath area during the flight season, you could have a lot of predation upon your bees from the birds. Fill your house completely with nesting material, leaving minimal gaps. Or if you've got a large house and maybe just getting going, you don't want to have quite that much nesting material to deal with all at once, fill up any available airspace in your house. If you leave a lot of exposed lengths of nesting material, whether you're using natural reeds or commercial tubes, it's going to increase the habitat for various parasites and predators, spiders, wasps, both actively predatory wasps and also parasitic wasps that lay their eggs through the tubes and through the nesting material and down into the developing egg and larva. So limit the access of these parasites and predators by limiting the airspace. Another critical point about your house siting is to keep in mind, these are not honeybees. Honeybees fly a couple of miles in terms of forage. They have to, given the density of population in a given area. Solitary bees like mason bees cover much shorter distances. So you need to make sure that you have an adequate supply of flowering plants that are flowering during the orchard mason bee life cycle, so maybe mid-March through mid-May. Also easy access to wet clay. And you would think that in Western Oregon in the spring, that would never be a challenge. But in practice, sometimes we do dry out, especially towards the tail end of the nesting season. Also, we tend to manicure or groom our landscapes pretty extensively. And so if you spend a lot of time with putting ground covers and turf and bark mulch over all your available soil, you have no access to that underlying clay mud for the bees to get. And they have to have that mud to nest. If they do not find it, they will nest elsewhere and not benefit your pollination. So provide some clay. You can either keep an open ground space and maybe rake it or scarify it so it's not packing down into a really tight, sheer, smooth surface that they can't get a hold of. Or you can dig up a little bit of clay mud, or you can buy commercial clay material specifically for mason bees, and keep a little dish of it below the house and keep it moist so that it's not drying out. Nesting materials. So we have, as I mentioned, a batch of native bees, some of which are cavity nesters like mason bees, others to take other strategies to the reproductive. Different species of bees prefer different size of tubes. Bees in general, when they're cavity nesters, will choose to utilize a hole or a cavity that is very close to their own diameter so that they can barely fit inside. It's just a tendency of the bees. Blue orchard mason bee prefers a diameter something around 8 millimeters, so roughly you know, a 3/8 to maybe 5/16 diameter hole. Now, if you're using natural reeds, and there's nothing wrong with using natural reeds that are naturally hollow stems, or very pithy plant materials that are so soft that the bees can actually get in without having to really chew their way in. You're not going to have exact diameter matches. It's got to be in the neighborhood, but it doesn't have to be ultra precise. Every bee is still an individual. Every bee does have some slightly different diameters, so they will make use of those tubes. Also, when you're using native materials in particular, keep in mind that we have a lot of native cavity nesters. And if you put a variety of tube sizes out there, you will get, over the course of an entire year, quite a diversity of species utilizing those cavities for nesting. And some of them are predatory wasps, others are various species of bees. Question in the chat, are earwigs harmful to mason bees? And you're finding earwigs in your nest. Earwigs are not actively predatory. They eat plants and plant parts. They're not, generally speaking, of any damage or risk to mason bees. Usually a high population density of earwigs is a sign of low activity level, and your tubes aren't being utilized. One of the things about getting obscure critters in the nesting tubes, there's a lot of insects that will utilize that tube as a shelter space. And so we do encourage you to not leave your nesting materials out year-round for your mason bees, but to pull them in seasonally. We'll talk about that just a little bit longer down the line. It is a little different if you're doing a multi-pollinator house where you put a whole batch of different types of media out there, and you try to see how many different pollinators and critters you can get nesting in them. In which case you do have to have those tubes out for longer, but you get also more non-beneficial or non-target insects using those cavities too. But earwigs themselves are not a problem. At home, I tend to get a lot of spiders if I leave my tubes out too long, and that's a problem. They're a lot harder on the bees. So you can use natural reeds or pithy stems. You shouldn't use bamboo. We're going to talk about in a couple of slides down here about how to harvest and clean your cocoons. And you will find that bamboo or plastic tubes are too hard to open up without damaging the cocoons inside. They're really hard and they're hard to split. So we do not recommend using bamboo as a material. There's a batch of commercially available materials that are really easy to harvest. And if you're using non-native, non-natural materials, I would focus on using commercial ones that are designed specifically for mason bee. A question in the chat about cleaning tubes. And if you are using natural materials, or if you're using the disposable tear-apart commercial tubes, we're not going to clean the tubes at all. You will utilize them and throw them away. If you are using wood trays, we'll talk about that in just a second here, they can be cleaned. So besides using tubes like this, one of the easy ways to have materials that are harvestable and more reusable than the disposable tubes is to basically take a block of wood and have the holes drilled into that block of wood of the appropriate diameter and back in about 6 inches. And then take a saw and you slice through the center of each of those rows of holes, creating a block that you can actually take off in layers with all the holes halfway split. And this enables you to easily take apart a whole nesting block, pull out the cocoons, clean out the nesting block, and reuse it in the future. Typically, if you're getting just a little bit of debris in your wooden nesting blocks, you can clean them out with a mild soapy water or with a very mild bleach solution, like what we use for cleaning the bees themselves. Don't use a straight bleach, and don't use chemical cleaning agents because some of those leave residues that can be harmful to your bees. So there's kind of a season to the blue orchard mason bee, and the beginning of the season really is about the mid to latter part of February, where you go ahead and put your house up and put your nesting materials out in the house. We're not going to release new cocoons this early. It's pretty chancy, but odds are in many areas around the local area, you will find native mason bees out earlier than maybe is perfect release conditions. And so if we provide a nesting site and materials, you may get some free mason bees on your own just from natural native populations. We don't want to release our new cocoons or overwintered cocoons until about mid-March. It's unless you're in a perfectly ideal environment, it's very unusual to have enough pollen resources combined with enough decent weather for the mason bees you're releasing to hatch out and get established without running out of resources. So mid-March, right about now or a week from now, right in that window, is an ideal release time for cocoons that you've wintered. So if you're doing a straight mason bee block, it's to your advantage to go ahead and pull all of your nesting materials in June, early to mid-June. Nesting is basically, egg laying is finished in May, mid to late May. Give them a chance to be fully capped off and get the last stragglers, and pull your nesting materials, because now you can put them in a place where they're more protected from damage, particularly from parasites. So I like to wrap them in some cheesecloth or some fine screening material and put them in a cardboard box with some holes in it. You need some air breathing in there, air circulation, but we're trying to protect them from rodents. And we're also trying to make sure that you're not getting new parasites coming in through the sidewalls of the nesting material. Okay, time frame for Calgary. I have no idea what your weather runs. Typically, we're releasing our mason bees when our daytime highs are at least frequently hitting in the 50s, but we also key it to flower development. And so that's one of your big things. So they'll tolerate some light frost. They'll shelter in their tubes during or sometimes under the leaves of plants during inclement weather. So you can be at frost points, but you really can't be lacking in pollen resources during their development stages. And once you put them out, they tend to hatch pretty fast, all in all. I bet your extension can give you better date times for Calgary specifically, but the key thing really is flower development. So you pull your nesting tubes, wrap them up, put them in a cardboard box. I put them in my garage. Any other kind of moderate temperature location. We would like to avoid the most extreme heat events over the summer, as well as protection from precipitation. So if you've got a really, really hot, small outbuilding, that's probably not ideal, something a little more insulated and protected than that. And then in October, we're going to actually pull the cocoons out of the nesting material individually and clean and store them for the winter. So I got a couple of questions in chat. So how long after a plum tree bloom is open does it have to get pollinated? Well, that really does depend quite a bit on weather conditions, how badly those flowers are getting impacted by precipitation events or hard cold messages, hard cold periods. Generally speaking, your flowering period on your plums is around 4 or 5 weeks, and that's kind of your window to get well pollinated. Why the delay after pulling tubes before harvest and cleaning of cocoons? Well, when you pull your nesting material in June, what you have is a little pad of pollen and an egg sitting on top of it. And you can't really safely pull that out. It needs the protected little chamber to gestate. Those eggs will hatch and develop into larvae. And those larvae will continue to consume that pollen patty that the female left behind as a food resource. And when they are mature enough, they've had enough food and enough period at warmer temperatures, that's why we can't refrigerate them right away either, then they will spin the cocoon and they will become a pupa, and they'll finish their gestational period in pupation. So we can't really handle them safely without damaging the young until about October. A question in chat about what type of flowers do they visit? Well, that's a really good question. So a lot of flowers are specifically evolved to be pollinated by bees. These are typically flowers that have kind of an open pattern with ready access to nectaries and to the pollen producing parts of the plant, so the bees can get to it for harvest. They can be salviform, so they have more trumpet shaped, or they can be disc shaped, or they can be rays like asters and such. So fruit trees are obviously perfectly shaped. They've got a very nice cup-shaped flower with very open exposed nectaries and very exposed pollen. Color matters. So bees see specific wavelength. Honeybees are more specific about this than a lot of other bees. And there are flowers that are pollinated by other things that don't provide the right cues for bees to find them. Generally speaking, though, most flowers that are open in the earlier part of the season are quite suitable flowers for mason bee pollination. So in the wild, you're seeing them on red flowering currant and Mahoney aquifolium, Oregon grape. In the garden, all your fruit trees are out this early. Quinces, ornamental quinces, are out this early. A lot of the flowering bulbs like daffodils and crocus are excellent resources. In your lawn, if you keep your lawn like I do, being that I do this 10 hours a day and I'm not the best weed controller in my lawn at home, dandelions are a favored resource for many bees, and mason bees thrive on dandelion. Okay, so as we get into do they go to pussy willow? Yes, they do. Most bees do. It has a decent nectar and an excellent pollen resource, and we do have a couple of natives. A lot of our natives come out on the tail end of the mason bee harvest season. Some of the introduced species bloom a bit earlier. So getting into October, we need to successfully harvest those cocoons, clean them to make sure we don't have mite and disease problems on them. Inspect for major parasites or other or diseases, things that are noticeable in terms of inappropriate development, and then clean them to make sure we're getting all these parasites and pests off. So you need to gently harvest your cocoons. They're more durable than you think, but you don't want to manhandle them too roughly. The natural reed materials are fairly easily split with a sharp knife. Knock the cap out, wedge your blade into the end of the reed, and just enough to get a crack, and then get your fingers into it and pull it apart. So a nice gentle split. Cocoons are not so loose usually in those tubes that they fly all over the place. But if you're waving them around a lot while you're splitting them open, you might lose some. Tend to lay them flat and pry up rather than try to split them down the middle vertically. The commercial nesting materials are mostly designed to quickly, easily spiral down. So they get a spiral pre-cut in them, and you can just get a little tear going and just carefully unwrap them, taking one cocoon at a time as you go down. The wood blocks we'd mentioned, you can take off a whole layer, and they make a little pushing tube to even limit the handling and risk of damage to your cocoons even more, that you can actually slide your cocoons down the tray and on out onto a surface on the other end of the tray. But minimize the amount of abuse you're putting on them, handle them gently, do a whole batch at once in terms of getting them out of the nesting materials, and then set them aside for treatment. Look carefully. What you're going to find is you'll find there's pollen residue. You'll also find it's real common to see some very small pollen mites if you get a magnifying glass out and take a good look. That's kind of normal. It's part of what we're going to take off in cleaning. What we want to really cull out at this stage, completely essentially hollow cocoons. You'll find a little dimple in a lot of them, but if they sound papery and they divot at the lightest handling, it's probably an empty cocoon that's had a parasite inside, and those usually are not worth keeping at that point. Like all bees, mason bees can get a variety of larval stage diseases, a type of chalk brood, for example, and you will see those as malformed larvae, usually not actually even developing the full cocoon. So pretty easy to identify the major problems. Once you've sorted out the obvious misfits and got your pile of cocoons ready for cleaning, it's time to clean them. Make a very mild bleach solution. If you go on the internet and you look at even reputable sites, you're going to get a whole batch of different numbers. My numbers are on the mild end of the recommendations. And don't go a lot stronger than this, but you'll see some of the other sites recommending stronger solutions than this. So if you do a tablespoon of bleach in a gallon, which is about the same as about a 1/4 teaspoon of bleach in a cup of water, and you mix that up into a solution, you can drop your cocoons into that solution and stir them gently, but with some motion. So you're getting a bit of swirl of that solution across the surface of the cocoons. You can swirl them in that for, a minute, minute and a half, maybe up to 2 minutes on the max, and then haul them out of that cleaning solution. Immediately rinse the cleaning solution off in just plain water. You can do it in gently under running water. You can have a clean dish of water to work in. And then once you've got them out of the rinse, they're going to need to get good and dry before they go into storage. I'm going to step back and catch a couple of questions. What type of parasites do they get? The dominant parasites in mason bees are microscopic wasps. So wasps are an interesting group as a whole, and there are probably more varieties of wasp than there are any other living organism out there, because most insects and bugs have one or often more species of parasitic wasp that are either parasitic or predatory on them. And so many insects will have predators in their adult wasps that are predators on them in their adult stage, and parasitic on them in either egg or larval stage. So this is the dominant concern there is parasitic wasps. Can you just put them in a strainer and run water over them? As part of your rinsing off of the bleach solution, yes. The advantage to using the bleach solution and not just trying to clean them with running water is that it's gentler in the first place. But secondly, you find that a lot of those little pollen dibs and pollen mites attached to those pollen dibs and fecal material, and in some cases, bacterial or fungal disease spores are adhered pretty well to the outside of that cocoon, and this bleach water solution helps rinse them off and kills off some of the spores to reduce the development of diseases later on. Question is, do mason bees like alliums? Mason bees like alliums. We have only a portion of our alliums come into flower before they're done pollinating. Alliums are big bee plants, though, in general, yes. So once you've got them rinsed off, you need to blot them dry gently again. Paper towels are fine, or clean rags. And then spread them out and let them air dry for 20 or 30 minutes. We want to get them good and dry before we put them into refrigeration. Once you've got them dry, you need to refrigerate them, because if you leave them out at room temperature, they're going to burn through their food resources, hatch in the middle of winter, and do nobody any good. So we're trying to control their digestion, control their developmental rate so that they're ready when they naturally would be ready. Can you put them out under natural outdoor temperatures? Yes, if you can provide really good protection for them, but that's really hard, and frankly, it's going to still be all over the place in terms of when they hatch out. So if you put them under normal refrigeration, 38, 39, 40 degree refrigeration, they'll hold for months and be ready to release in late February through late March window of time. Most modern refrigerators are a bit too dry. They tend to dry out the air pretty substantially. So you need to control the humidity in that refrigerator where you're storing them. And best way to do that is not to change the humidity of your fridge as a whole, but to provide a humidity chamber for them to develop in. We're targeting about roughly a 60% humidity. So there are a variety of ways you can do that. I'll show you in just a couple of slides down here a commercially made humidity chamber. You can do the same thing with plastic berry crates or similar devices like that. Make sure it's got good ventilation holes. We're not trying to seal them in an airtight environment. And you can put a little bit of a layer of wet paper towel in the bottom of that. and make sure it's wrung out so it's just damp, and put your cocoons on that. The commercial chambers are a little fancier. They put a very thin layer of carbon film and then a spongy material into that. So your spongy material goes on the bottom, and then a thin layer of carbon film, and then the cocoons are sitting on that. That can just simply reduce some of the some organisms that can develop in the water from migrating up into the cocoons. If you are using a traditional refrigerator in your house that you get into all the time, that's probably just sufficient like that. If you're using a spare fridge that you use seasonally, like I have a couple actually out in the garage for my gardening, if it's a fridge you don't get into with any kind of regularity and you're putting your mason bees into it, you need to open it out and vent it, get some air exchange happening at least every couple of weeks to make sure you've got fresh air in there, because it can go stagnant and you can lose them to suffocation. Keep an eye on them. It's a good idea to check on them periodically anyway. Keep an eye on them. If you're seeing a shriveling happen, you might want to re-humidify a bit. If you're seeing mold develop, you're probably a little too damp, and it's best to go ahead and re-bleach water them, re-dry them, and re-put them out into storage. When you are storing them in your refrigerator, it doesn't have to be a broad flat dish with one layer of cocoons. You can stack them 4 or 5, maybe even 6 cocoons deep. Much past 5 or 6 layers, we start worrying about weight limits and maybe damaging some of the cocoons on the bottom. So don't get way carried away with stacking them deep. But it doesn't have to be just a solitary layer. You have some window there to work with. So it doesn't take a huge amount of space to actually raise a tremendously large number of cocoons. Now, when you get experienced at doing this and you're getting a couple of hundred cocoons going or what have you, you might want to consider, rather than releasing all of your cocoons every spring all at once, you might consider releasing them in batches just to give you some insurance. If I released my mason bees a week ago and now we've had 6 days of windy, rainy, and cooler weather, yes, they are more tolerant than honeybees, but still, it can be too stormy and wet for them to fly. And those bees are likely to starve before they can reproduce. So having the option of putting several batches out definitely can ensure a higher ongoing success rate. If you get really good at it, you can kind of eyeball and determine the males and female ratio by the size of cocoons. Males are smaller, and you want to make sure you're releasing a kind of a mixture of males and females every release batch. When you buy them commercially, the companies, the reputable companies will sort them for you to a reasonable degree, at least, to make sure you have an adequate number of males in the batch. Don't just select all the biggest cocoons. That's not going to do you any good. So, kind of the basic overview on mason bee culture and management. So a couple of samples, pictures courtesy of crown bees. Love to see you do business with people like us and your local suppliers, but if you're going to go online, people like Crown Bees have a solid reputation for knowing what they're doing and providing good quality supplies. So on the left is a typical mason bee house that can hold a couple of larger wood blocks, or it can hold a batch of tubes, 40, 50 tubes easy, and still have airspace you need to plug. On the right hand is, as I was mentioning, a humidity. So it's your cocoon storage for refrigerator. You can see the carbon layer there, and the sponge layer is kind of hidden behind that carbon layer underneath. Okay, so in chat, when I've ordered bees previously, most of them had hatched by the time they arrived. What should I expect from a reputable supplier? A reputable supplier will have bees that are shipped right away, and usually will ship with a small amount of a refrigerant, a cold block or something, to get to you. If it works in your situation, and it doesn't work for everybody, I get that, you are much better to find a local mason bee supplier that is working with local mason bees. And we try to do that as much as we can here at the nursery. Our local supplier is unable to this year after COVID. They were unable to supply, so we're back to ordering bees from Crown Bees specifically ourselves. Nothing wrong with that. We've done that for years before, but our Crown Bees, of course, is in Washington. So those aren't really a local population. And what we're trying to avoid here by working as local as possible is what tends to happen with the honeybee situation when they're used for commercial pollination, or with bumblebees when they have a history of being used for commercial pollination too. And when you get a successful strain of bees that you want to sell to people to provide for their pollination needs, and you start sending those bees all over the country, any pests, parasites, diseases that have accumulated in your bees are now getting dispersed to other populations. And this is what happens with varroa mites in honeybee. This is what happened with mad bee disorder in bumblebees. You can wipe out a huge amount of potential pollination ability by inadvisedly, randomly shipping bees all over the place. So I would say reputable is first, local bees as much as you can. It's not always possible. And secondly, secondly, somebody who has got a good reputation. The crown bees that we've used here in Washington are very good. I don't know too much about other resources for completely other regions. And that's something I think you're gonna have to maybe, again, check with your local extension. Mason bees as a pollination resource is very widely regarded, and a lot of extensions and extension universities have programs specifically on mason bees and other solitary pollinators for your area. Some examples of more mason bee supplies. The wood blocks, as you can see there, is the harvest block. It's done on a jig, so it's really easy for them to mass produce them. That's why you've got the ridges on the top as well. It's certainly possible to make one on your own, but oh my, they're not that expensive. And to me, the amount of work going into making something like that. Worth pointing out, you see the black markings on the entrances there. And you can do the same thing with disposable tubes or even with natural reeds. So mason bees do focus on pheromone, and they will tend to come to areas that have been used by mason bees before for nesting material. But once they have selected a nest location, then they reorient to their specific hole they're using by visual cues. So these markings, these burn markings on the outside, are to provide some visual diversity to make it easier for the returning females to find the specific tube they're already laying in and finish laying it out. And that's an interesting little sideline. You can do, like I say, you can do the same thing with clean latex paints, or you can do the same thing with a little burner on other types of tube to give them those visual keys. If you're using disposable tubes, rather than marking them with a torch or marking them with paint, I'll just usually stagger mine so they're out at slightly different levels outside of the house. They got just slightly, just very small, 1/8 inch, 1/4 inch variation in how far the tube projects provides an excellent visual cue for your bees. And okay. Questions in chat. I'm sorry, I don't know anybody in Florida for bees. I would recommend you contact your extension university to see who has bees specifically for your area. You're far enough south, you're probably not blue orchard mason bees. You may be red masons or a variety of other solitary bees. It won't be identical information because it's significantly different climate. When staggering deployment of cocoons, what time delay do you recommend? I recommend about a 10 to 14 day delay. So basically releasing 2 or 3 batches. Start releasing in Western Oregon, start releasing about mid-March, late March, maybe mid-April. Releasing after mid-April is getting dicey. You're at the very end of the lifespan for most of these bees already. Is there a way to salvage cocoons when you find mold on them? Yes, get them out of the container you've been storing them in, run them through a bleach water rinse again, get them dried out again, and then restore them. Make sure in the interim you take the time to thoroughly clean the storage container to make sure you don't have spores still sitting in it. How can we encourage bees to reproduce naturally in our backyard? So, general pollinator 101. All organisms need food and shelter and water. Now, mason bees are a little bit different because they get plenty of water from feeding and from the natural rainfall, at least in our area. The food resources in this case is pollen. So having a wide diversity of pollen-producing plants that are available through the season, if you're focusing on a specific season, or throughout the year if you're wanting a broad diversity of pollinators. Different pollinators have different seasons substantially. The bees are the champions of this in that you have, one of the reasons we have 200 plus species in Western Oregon. We have the earlies and the later springs and the early summers and the late summers, a batch of different species all through those timelines that provide the pollination behavior. Shelter material. So a couple of things about shelter and nesting material. These perfectly manicured landscapes are not good for pollinators. If you bark everything and you make sure you prune everything to a nicety, and then you take all those clippings out and you throw them away or you compost them, that's not good pollinator habitat. It's important that you have some of those nesting resources. So for mason bees, we mentioned the clay mud. For leafcutter bees, there are species of plants like roses are a good example. Ash tree is another good example that they like to cut the chunks of leaf out of to use for their nesting materials. The bumblebees tend to utilize either old bird nests or old mouse nests in the ground. And so keeping that completely cleaned up is not ideal either. But the easiest thing you can manage besides not destroying habitat is food resources. And then if you like to do the mason bee thing, you might enjoy doing these broader pollinator houses where you take a house like a mason bee house, or sometimes a little bit larger scale, and you put a wide diversity of potential nesting materials in that. And then you go through and you can pull your mason bees out in June still. You can find out who's sealed if you want to intentionally manage them a little tighter. Other than that, what you do is you just let the whole season go out, let whatever nests in those nesting materials nest it. And then in the late fall, after all, usually about October, after all nesting activity is done and before the worst of the wet and cold comes in, you pull all that nesting material, and again, you insulate it from rodents and parasites, and you put it in your garage where it can be kind of protected but not warm, where it can stay cool and they'll kind of develop at a natural rate. So an unheated garage or a shed. Then in the spring, because we don't want to reuse nesting material, thus encouraging parasites, we want to use fresh nesting material every year so we don't have a buildup of parasites and disease problems. You put a whole new batch of nesting material in your bee house, and you create a release chamber for your tubes, your nesting material. It can be as simple as a Tupperware box with a good sized hole drilled in it. You put all your nesting material in that, and it holds a ½ inch or 3/4 inch, probably around 3/4 inch, because we do get some bigger bees in those sometimes. So that as they hatch in that dark enclosed space, they see the light from the exit hole you've put in, and they fly to that. But when they're returning to find nesting locations, that hole in that thin wall of that tub does not register as a cavity. It's a nestable cavity to them. So they'll find something else nearby to utilize. You can do the same thing. You can create release chambers for your mason bees. A lot of bee houses, you see the upper chamber of this house, a lot of them will have a little ceiling portion with a hole drilled in it, and so you can put your cocoons up in that and let them develop out and then emerge separate from your actual nesting materials. You can do the same thing with a small chunk of PVC with a hole drilled in it. Lots of options. The key here is when you're releasing cocoons from nesting material, it's really, really important that you don't allow bees to come back and immediately reuse that nesting material because of parasites and diseases. Okay, so a question, mason bee tubes and bricks available in Europe? Good question. I wish I had a good answer for you. One of the fun things about doing these Zoom classes is we get people from all over the place. The bad news about that is I know my region really well, but globally it's a whole different game. So again, ag universities would best be able to describe what you have for native pollinators and solitary bees. You'll have some, I just don't know who they are or what their life cycles are specifically, and give you some guidelines for encouraging their populations. But it is noticeably different from region to region. The difference between Western Oregon and Eastern Oregon is phenomenal in terms of the bee habitat, especially. So You'll have to get a little more closer to home advice on that one, I'm afraid. So how do we cut open the tubes without hurting the cocoons? Okay, so you see the easy tear strips here on the picture I've got up right now, the inserts. So those, you can keep those old cardboard tubes, the thick cardboard tubes, and reuse them. You just get new inserts every year. And those things are spiral cut. So you get your thumbnail under you find where the spiral comes to the edge, get your thumbnail under that and tear, and it will just spiral down. When you're using natural materials like reeds, take a sharp knife and carefully dig the outer cap, the outer plug off the end. Then if you put the edge of your knife into that, the blade of your knife into the end of that reed, and just enough to get it to start splitting, just a little tap to get it to start splitting, but don't try to split it down with the knife itself. Just get it to start. Then you pull your knife out and you'll gently pry the halves of the reed apart. Natural reed and stick materials, once you've got them that are hollow like that are nested in, once you've got them started, they will tear pretty readily. Do it slow and gentle so you're not accidentally tearing across a cocoon. But it's easier than you think, unless you're using things like bamboo, which are really hard to split without putting a lot of force into it. So mason bees, I think Alana, if you wouldn't mind shooting me an email on that, Darren@chenards.com or info@chenards.com, will get you taken care of on that end. It's better than quoting over open chat like this. Is under the house eave too high for nest? It is not. Under the house eave is quite adequate. Just don't be so high under the eave that you're blocking too much sun. That sun exposure is important. All right, so at this point in time, we're kind of at the end of the presentation. If anybody's got any follow-up questions, I'd love to hear them. Other than that, you know where to find me, Darren, D-A-R-R-E-N, @chenards.com if you got any follow-up questions. And as I mentioned, we will have a copy of this posted on our YouTube. Check it out. We've got some other classes we've done there and some other short videos for more gardening information. I want to thank you all very much for attending. I appreciate it. Okay, so what fruit trees are the really early flowers? The big ones here in Western Oregon that we really focus on mason bees for, that mason bees do so much better than honeybees because of how early they are the plums and the pears, particularly the Asian pears, but all pears are pretty early. Then the other major stone fruits like peaches and nectarines are pretty early. Mason bees are still beneficial as we get later into the cycle. For example, your apple trees and your cherry trees are well pollinated by mason bees as well, but they're also late enough that honeybees can do an efficient job of that. Bleach concentration. And as I mentioned, if you go online, you'll find a lot of different recommendations. Our very mild recommendation is 1 tablespoon per gallon of water, 1 tablespoon of bleach per gallon of water, which if you math it out, it works out to just about 1/4 teaspoon in a cup of water. And so unless you're managing thousands of mason bees, you really don't need to make a gallon at a time. So I'm typically making about 2 cups at a time for cleaning out just my home cocoons. Yep, there in the chat, Beth. Yes, that is our YouTube. Come check out our videos, and that's where this will be posted after we've had a chance for the office people to get it edited and posted. To keep the garden pollinated after June, would you recommend keeping other types of bees? Yes. So leafcutter bees can also be managed kind of like mason bees. It would be a whole nother class topic, so I won't get completely into it. But leafcutters are active from about mid to late June through August, roughly. There's, again, a batch of different species. They're smaller bees than mason bees. They use smaller nesting materials, usually between 4 and 6 millimeters. they cocoon and develop differently. So rather than harvesting and cleaning the cocoons, we pull and store the nesting materials in the fall and then just gestate them in the nesting materials. Now, leafcutter bees are notorious for very tiny wasp parasites, and we do like to actually plan ahead. There's kind of a complicated schedule for figuring out when you want to release these and then gestating them at room temperature until they're ready to go and then putting them out. So it's a little more complicated than mason bee management. But what we'll normally do is we'll start the gestation period in a paper bag inside, and we'll check it every few days for after that first week of room temperature gestation. And we'll watch for the little clouds of emerging parasitic wasps and squash them and kill them off. And then when the bees come out just a little later, and then we can release the bees safely without releasing all the parasites. The other big pollinator in the garden and in the orchard, and really after about early April or so, is honeybees. So honeybees are highly efficient because, not that the individuals are not as efficient, but when you're talking about honeybees, a good colony, even in the early part of the season, is thousands of bees, and by the end of the season can be 50 or 60,000 bees in a hive. So the volume of pollinating they do is tremendous. Unlike all of the other bees, solitary bees, they tend to have a full year of pollination, at least in Western Oregon. For example, even in January, we had a couple of warm days. We'd see bees flying and doing a little scouting and foraging where they could find anything. Not that there's much in January for them to get a hold of. So the honeybees' advantage are one hive goes over the entire pollination season, but they do tend to miss a bit on the early season because they're not building up yet. And because they forage so heavily because of their population density, they tend to do a really good job of pollination. So different sizes of holes for different species. Yes, absolutely. And so even different species of mason bee will use slightly different diameters of hole. Our native solitary bees that are cavity nesters include some very big bees and also a whole batch of very, very tiny bees. So if you're doing a multi-pollinator house, you definitely want a variety of different diameters of nesting material for them to utilize. And so I say the orchard mason bee is pretty specific. Our typical leafcutter bee that we're using commercial or using for home pollination is another group, but everything in between and on both extremes outside of that even. Books to recommend. Mason Bee Revolution is probably the most comprehensive treatment of blue orchard mason bee. I'm sorry, the author's escaping me at the moment, but the book is called Mason Bee Revolution. Okay, suggestions of hole sizes, please. If you start at around 4 millimeters and you go up to about 10 millimeters, you cover most solitary cavity nesters. Blue orchard mason bee likes 8 millimeters. For those of us who are not on metric, that's about 3/8 of an inch. All right, we are going to sign it off for the day. And I say any follow-up questions, don't hesitate to contact me at the nursery. Thank you very much and appreciate the attendance.